Well, hi there. My name's Chris Hathaway, and I don't want to waste your time, so I'm just going to jump right in. It's something that I've become increasingly aware of over the years, since my time as a nerdy science student in high school, to college, to grad school, to now being a science teacher, is this idea that science and the Bible just don't mix. Almost as though these two things are mortal enemies or something, and it's up to you to pick which one to roll with. Because certainly they don't roll in the same direction. But having been a high school science teacher for quite a while now, I just can't help but share with you how much I disagree with that statement. Because from where I sit, a straightforward reading of Scripture matches up very well with a straightforward interpretation of the scientific evidence. What you're going to see here in a couple minutes includes some videos that I made on this topic based off a book that I wrote. That book is No God, No Way. Punctuation is very important. Available at bookstores everywhere. By that I mean really just Amazon. But the videos were designed to be watched after reading their corresponding chapter, and what you're going to find here include the middle 7 of those. They're the ones that deal with the science. So I also decided to throw in the epilogue video just to kind of round the whole thing out. But if you want to watch the other videos, I'll find a spot for them in the description somewhere. Now, I do want to make sure that you realize right up front here that the main thread that's going to run through these 7 videos is really my belief that number 1, the world is not billions of years old, and number 2, that naturalistic processes can't explain how everything got here. So if you believe different than me, guess what? That's just fine. A lot of people do. But if you're so entrenched that you're not open to one or both of those possibilities, you might just want to spend your time elsewhere. Not to be rude, like I said at the start, I don't want to waste your time. For the rest of you though, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Well, that was a lot of information compared with the first bunch of chapters, wasn't it? You know, we can talk and guess and hypothesize all day long about how the Big Bang could have happened and the magical mechanisms that somehow got it going 14 billion years ago. But when we look at real observational science and we look with our own eyes at things like planets and moons and galaxies, all these things have characteristics that they really shouldn't have if they're billions of years old. You know, in the book I talk specifically about Saturn and Pluto, but you can say this about any planet in our solar system, really. Our own good Earth, for instance. You know, we've got a magnetic field, which is great, because without it, we'd all be dead. But our magnetic field is getting weaker over time. You know, just the last 180 years, it's gotten about 10% weaker. So if the Earth really is billions of years old, the magnetic field should not still be here. Not at that rate. And it's not just planets. You know, most of the planets in our solar system have moons. Specifically, Saturn's moon Enceladus and Neptune's moon Triton. These are small worlds. And these little worlds are erupting just enormous quantities of water and ammonia and other volatile materials out into space at just crazy rates of speed. You know, if they've been doing this for billions of years, they should have long since run dry. And it's not just our solar system either. You know, the deeper we look in space, we see the same thing. You know, when you look at distant galaxies, they don't look the way they should if they're really billions of years old. So they had to invent dark matter. And their motion in space makes absolutely no sense. So they had to invent dark energy. And the universe, its temperatures are just way too even. So they had to invent inflation. In other words, when we look out into space and just make very straightforward observations about what's there, they don't line up with what we'd expect to see if the Big Bang and its billions of years of time are true. And these are exciting times in astronomy because a growing number of astrophysicists are starting to realize this. I'd like to continue with some excerpts from a document called Bucking the Big Bang. It came out in New Scientist magazine a while back, and it's authored by 33 leading secular scientists. And among other things, they had this to say. The Big Bang today relies on a growing number of hypothetical entities, things that we have never observed. Inflation, dark matter, and dark energy are the most prominent examples. Without them, there would be a fatal contradiction between the observations made by astronomers and the predictions of the Big Bang theory. But the Big Bang can't survive without these fudge factors. Without the hypothetical inflation field, the Big Bang does not predict the smooth isotropic background radiation that is observed, because there'd be no way for parts of the universe that are now more than a few degrees away in the sky to come to the same temperature and thus emit the same amount of microwave radiation. It goes on. In no other field of physics would this continual recourse to new hypothetical objects be accepted as a way of bridging the gap between theory and observation. It would at the least raise serious questions about the validity of the underlying theory. What is more, the Big Bang theory can boast of no quantitative predictions that have subsequently been validated by observation. The successes claimed by the theory's supporters consist of its ability to retrospectively fit observations with a steadily increasing array of adjustable parameters. Whew. And I mean, that's the secular scientific community right there, you know? To believe in the Big Bang is really to take a rather messy philosophical position here. It's not something that the evidence overwhelmingly points to, as many would have us believe. Instead, when we actually observe our planet, solar system, galaxy, and universe, we see the exact things we'd expect to see if they were made in the recent past by a God who loves us and cares for us. It really is true, folks. The heavens declare the glory of God. So that was kind of an abstract chapter, wasn't it? It's tough for us to wrap our minds around these concepts when most of us don't spend a lot of time looking through a powerful microscope at the inner workings of a cell. I know I don't. So, congratulations on making it through, and things do get more tangible from here on out. But in this chapter, we're talking about life springing forth from non-life, but of course, you can't just start there. If you're going to get life coming about on its own, you first need the building blocks of life to come together. And those are amino acids. Well, trying to get amino acids to come together from a mindless soup of chemicals and molecules is a lot like trying to put a puzzle together just by shaking it enough times. Intuitively, you know that's not going to work. Even if you had a box that was just the right size, there are physical forces that prevent that from happening. Even if you did end up with two pieces that were supposed to come together and they link up in just the right way, you know that as soon as you shake that box again, those pieces are coming apart and you're back to square one. And the exact same thing is actually happening in the microscopic world. This primordial soup that it's often called, that life supposedly arose in, would surely have water in it. All living things need water. But a chemical property of water is that it actually breaks up molecules as they link up and get more complicated. So even if you did magically have all the right ingredients in this warm little pond, if they're swimming around in water, you're not getting anywhere. Folks, life can't just arise from a random pool of chemicals. That's what the law of biogenesis is all about. That's why it's a law. Life doesn't come from anything other than life. You can't get the building blocks of life to come together on their own. You can't even get the building blocks of the building blocks to come together, even if you did have billions of years to work with. But I'll tell you, if we're thinking about life as just having the right molecules at the right places and the right times, we're really missing the point here. You and me and the simplest living cell are way more than just the sum of our parts. We're way more than just the molecules that make us up. In the book, I use the example of your phone. All right, if you take your phone and you rip off the back, and you'd look in there and you'd see all sorts of sophisticated hardware, lots of microchips and fancy things. But that sophistication is nothing compared to the software programs that are running on your phone making it work. If someone erased all those programs, you wouldn't be able to turn it on, you wouldn't be able to use your flashlight, you couldn't send a message or find directions to the nearest pizza place. It would just be awful. All the hardware would still be there, right? Everything would still look the exact same. Everything is in the right place for it to work, but if it's not programmed to do anything, then it's a brick. And folks, the simplest living cell is the same. The molecular programs working inside a so-called simple cell, if you've taken biology, you know the simple cell really isn't simple. That amount of programming and sophistication would put our most advanced software today to shame. So if we're thinking of life as just having the right soup of chemicals coming together, we're really not appreciating what it takes to be alive. The real miracle of life coming from non-life would be how all those tiny bits of a cell got programmed with the information to do exactly what they need to do so that the cell could live, thrive, survive, and by the way, replicate itself. Not a small feat. Programs don't write themselves, folks. Not in the real world, anyway. There's only one author of life, and it's not Mother Nature, it's not Father Time, it's God. To him be the glory. Well, that was a section on genetics and DNA. I hope it went okay for you. I just want to spend our time together sort of summarizing the most important parts from that. You know, your DNA is like your own personal instruction manual. You know, because of it, your whole body looks the way it looks and works the way it works. Now, if you were to zoom in on any part of your body, inside and out, you'd notice that it's made up of these tiny little cells that are all bunched together. Your heart's made up of heart cells, your liver is made up of liver cells, your skin is made up of skin cells. Unfortunately, though, those cells don't last forever. So to make sure that you don't die along with them, they have to replicate themselves. But every time they replicate, it messes up your DNA a little. And bit by bit, year after year, as your cells replicate, your body's instruction manual gets worse and worse. Like if you make a copy of a book page, and then you take that copy and you make another copy. And you take that copy and you make another copy. You take that copy and you make another copy. And eventually you get to a point where the information on that sheet is going to be awfully tough to read. And when our DNA gets to that point, things start going wrong. You know, we call these copy errors in our genetic code, we call them mutations. And they're the reason that your skin gets worse over time. They're the reason your joints get worse over time. It's ultimately why we age, and in the end, it's why we die. Things actually get worse than that, though, believe it or not, because these copy errors are also occurring in our reproductive organs. Meaning not only do they wreck our genetic information and ultimately kill us, they're wrecking the DNA of our kids before they're even born. You pass a certain number of mutations onto your children. So genetically, they start off worse than you, just like you started off worse than your parents. And this is important because what are we teaching our kids in school today? We're teaching them that the human race has been evolving upward, getting better and better and better and better over all these years, when in reality, we're getting worse and worse and worse and worse. I mean, that's the exact opposite of what we would expect to see if naturalism and the grand story of evolution were true. But of course, it's exactly what we would expect to see from the biblical version of history, where everything started out perfect, but has been in a constant state of decay ever since the fall. And it's kind of sobering for us to realize that there's nothing we can do to stop that deterioration. I mean, we can do things to offset the effects of the fall to an extent, right? We can treat diseases and relieve pain and help people to live longer, but in the end, that can only go so far. I mean, you can't fix a decaying genome in the long term in the same way that you can't expect to just keep fixing a car as its frame is rusting through. And I know that's depressing to hear, but I mean, it should serve as a reminder to us that we're not to put our hope in the perishing things of this world, but we should be looking forward to the day when we're going to be raised imperishable. Our hope is in Christ, because just as surely as he rose, we too will rise. You know, we live in this world 24/7, and it's so easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking that this is all that there is. But it's not. The Apostle John gives us a little bit of a preview on what we have to look forward to in the book of Revelation, and he says this, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. You know, this world of sin and death and suffering, yeah, we live here. We're just visiting. Heaven's our real home. Well, that was a section on natural selection. And, I don't think any of us can deny that one of the most influential books that's been written in the last 200 years was Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And the title really says it all. The origin of species. Everything we see in our world today got its start through this magical process of natural selection. And in this chapter of the book, I use a family of dogs to illustrate exactly why it is that this process by itself can't get you the variety of creatures that we see in front of us today. But what I'd like to do with our time right now is just use a different example to show you the same thing. And this is an example the scientific community likes to use to basically say, look, we see change happening right in front of us. Surely evolution is true. And in order to do that, I have to introduce you to a friend of mine. This is Finley, as in Elephantly. He's Irish. He's also a little bit sad, because he knows, and I know, that 200 years ago in Africa, the average tusk length on an elephant was actually twice as big as what we find today. And he's a little bit jealous, and I can't say I blame him. So what happened here? Hunters, when they go after elephants, are going to go after the ones with the bigger tusks. So when you kill off all the big tusk elephants, you're just left with the little tusk ones to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so they're the ones that are having all the little baby elephants. So the tusk length in this population of elephants has changed rather dramatically over these last 200 years. But the question isn't whether or not these elephants are changing. They most certainly are. The real question is whether or not those changes can one day get you a brand new animal. And it really doesn't seem like that much of a stretch, does it? I mean, we've seen a dramatic change in elephant tusk length in just the last 200 years. Can you imagine if you had 200 million to work with? I mean, the amount of changes that could build up in that period of time, at the end of it, maybe you don't even have an elephant anymore. But this is where we have to be very careful. Think about how this change happened, right? We began with elephants that had a variety of tusk lengths, but now we're just left with the little tusk elephants. In other words, genetic information in this population has been lost. What do you suppose you need for these elephants to one day branch off into a brand new animal? You'd need an addition of genetic information for that to happen. So natural selection actually goes the wrong way. A lot of people like to pretend that all change is the same, and that as long as you have enough of it, you can get one kind of animal turning into another one over a long period of time. But natural selection does not create the fit. It doesn't make anything. All it does is eliminate the unfit. Regardless of how long you give it, this type of change can't get you the new DNA information to code for features that this animal didn't have before. And mutations don't help, of course. We talked about those in the last section. All they do is wreck genetic information. Remember, all they are copy errors in your genetic code. They're not magical information-giving miracles. You do not want them. They're bad. They rarely give survival advantages, and even when they do, it's just a result of that creature's genetic code being broken or corrupted or destroyed in some way. And just like the process of natural selection itself, that's exactly the opposite of what needs to happen for the grand story of evolution to be true. To get brand new animals, you need a mechanism to get you brand new genetic information, not something that just messes up what's already there. Natural selection, small changes, speciation, whatever you want to call it, it's real, observable science. Nobody denies that. But the bigger story of evolution by common descent, It requires something fundamentally different. It requires new genetic information to be made from scratch. And that's something that we never, ever see happening. Isn't that right, Finley? Congratulations, you just finished the longest chapter in the book, by far. So nice job with that. I know that was a long one. In our short time together here, though, we got to talk about dinosaurs, right? Everybody loves talking about dinosaurs. I don't even know how many Jurassic Park movies are out there now. I do kind of wonder, though, sometimes how many more need to be made before people start to realize that it's probably not a good idea to keep making these dinosaur theme parks. But whether you're into dinosaurs or not, at some point in your life, you've undoubtedly heard the phrase, millions of years ago when dinosaurs ruled the earth. And it's like, okay, you know, if dinosaurs really were last here 65 million years ago, then we'd expect to see certain things when we look at their fossils. But if they've been around a lot more recently, as the Bible seems to indicate, then we would expect to find something completely different when we look at their fossils. So, what do we see? Well, when we look at these dinosaur fossils and we dissolve away the mineral, oftentimes we are finding blood cells and blood vessels. We're finding soft tissue and intact DNA. We're finding muscle fibers and ligaments that are still stretchy. Folks, this is organic material. It breaks down very quickly over time, especially in the tropical conditions that these dinosaurs would have thrived in. I mean, this stuff can't last for 1 million years, let alone 65 million. After that period of time, on a molecular level, it would have broken down to the point that you can't even recognize it anymore. And yet, here it is, right in front of us, staring at us in the face. So, I mean, as somebody who believes the Bible and its history, I believe that the earth is just about 6,000 years old, and what we're finding in these bones matches up well with that timeline. Of course, the scientific community has a different response, though, right? Remember, their starting assumption, their foundational belief is in naturalism, the idea that you don't need a creator or a God to explain things. What they do need, though, are millions and billions of years of time so that their creation story has time to unfold. But, you know, what they do then is just, instead of looking at the observational evidence that we were just talking about and saying, you know, folks, there's no way our timeline can be right here. It must be off somewhere. Instead of saying that, they say, so this is showing us that we really don't understand decay. And that's a real quote. So what they've done is they have looked at the observational evidence, the observational science, and they have overridden what it plainly says in favor of their philosophical belief about when dinosaurs existed. And of course, they're doing the best they can to explain this stuff away. But it's not just fossils that point to these dinosaurs having been around a lot more recently. When you look at the tapestries and the sculptures and the drawings and the carvings and the murals and the embroidery from ancient civilizations all across the globe, they all show depictions of these creatures that look exactly like the dinosaurs we find in the fossil record. I mean, they're honestly so similar, you could show them to any adolescent, and not only will they tell you that's a dinosaur, they will tell you the exact kind of dinosaur that it is. And of course, I mentioned this in the book. The best thing that you can look at to see what I'm talking about here is the book Dire Dragons by Vance Nelson. It's a great resource. Can't say enough good things about it. Be sure to check that out. It's super interesting. But, you know, I believe that humans and dinosaurs walked this earth together. Probably not holding hands, but that's what a straightforward interpretation of the evidence points to. More importantly, it's what a straightforward reading of Scripture points to as well. These dinosaurs were created on day 6 of the creation week, the same day as humans. They would have been on the ark, and they would have come off the ark and shared the world with us for at least a while afterwards. Well, congratulations, you made it through another one. Obviously, I've shaved a little bit since we were last together. My students tell me I should hang on to the scruff, though, so I think I'll keep that for at least a little while. But it is warming up here, so the timing was right. Spring has officially arrived, and in Wisconsin, what that means for us is that we're actually seeing temperatures in the low 40s. So I don't know what that means where you come from, but up here, that's beach-going weather. But anyway, this section goes hand in hand with the last section, right? The fossils that we talked about in the fossil record are embedded in the rock layers of the geologic record. And you can see these layers anywhere for yourself, any place that there's a big enough gash in the landscape. Grand Canyon would be the most obvious example. And if you've ever been to Grand Canyon, one of the things you probably noticed is how all these layers are very easy to see. A lot of them have completely different colors. Another thing that you probably noticed, though, is that each of these layers are extremely flat. Well, if these layers are really separated by millions of years, like any brochure at the park will tell you, then they shouldn't be that way. You know, erosion is a very powerful force. How often do we hear about fires and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes and sometimes even volcanoes ripping up the old and carving new landscapes? I mean, just imagine what this erosion would do to a surface over 1 million years. I mean, over that period of time, even a mildly consistent rainfall would have a huge impact. These layers should be anything other than flat, and yet here they are, stacked like pancakes. Of course, that's exactly what we would expect to see if they were laid down very quickly, one after another, during Noah's flood. Now, the mere mention of the biblical flood perhaps being true would make any secular scientist giggle to themselves, and they can make fun of it if they want, but it makes perfect sense of the data that's right in front of us. And not just from a physical perspective, but a historical one too. You know, it's been very popular for a long time to say that the Old Testament writers got the idea of Noah's flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh over in Babylon. And it's like, okay, you know, if a worldwide flood is just fiction, then why are there legends of one in ancient Persia and Peru and China and Native America, and Aboriginal Australia, and isolated islands like Hawaii and Fiji? Over 300 ancient cultures have some sort of catastrophic flood event as part of their traditions. Folks, obviously a vast majority of these people never interacted with each other. So what makes more sense here? That they all just happen to have made up the same pretend flood story? Or that they all point back to the same real historical event? You know, it's kind of interesting. In the same way that these ancient cultures left us records of dinosaur-like creatures, they also left us records of a worldwide flood. So, in the end, from these last two sections, what I really want to have you grab hold of, if I can be serious again for a little bit, as serious as I can be in a Hawaiian shirt, right? What I really want you to take away from these two sections is that regardless of whether you're trying to make sense of the physical evidence that we see across the world, or from the historical records that we've gathered from cultures across the globe, they all match up eerily well with a straightforward reading of Scripture. And that shouldn't surprise us. The truth has a way of coming out, even if the world doesn't want to listen. Well, here we are, Radiometric Dating, the last full-fledged science chapter in the book. And in order to understand radiometric dating, you have to understand a little bit about radioactivity. So, how would you respond if I told you that the chair you're sitting in right now was radioactive? Well, if you believed me, and you're sane, you'd probably get away from that chair pretty fast, right? But why is that? Well, if something is radioactive, what that means is that the atoms, the molecules, the stuff that makes it up is unstable. Over time, it changes into another element that actually is stable and is not radioactive. So that's good anyway. But this process of changing, or decaying as we call it in the science world, comes with a side effect. As it occurs, a lot of potentially harmful energy gets released. And you can probably guess, we call this energy radiation. That's the reason for all the nasty things that are going to happen to you if you continue sitting in your radioactive chair. But this was the process that gave rise to the idea of radiometric dating. And you can kind of think of it like an hourglass. You know, you start with a bunch of radioactive material, and over time it decays into non-radioactive material. And based on how much of these you see at any point, proportionally in your hourglass, you can estimate how long the thing has been running. So this was the method that was used to get the age of the Earth to 4.5 billion years. And it's actually a very straightforward method. The math is actually not all that bad, all things considered, believe it or not. But this is where we have to be very careful. You see, the different radioactive elements decay at very different rates. And the elements that were used to date the age of the Earth decay extremely slowly, like crazy slow. Imagine coming across this hourglass and it's moving in super duper slow motion. It almost looks frozen in time, it's moving so slow. So you can still see the proportions. You could still measure the decay rate if you've got sensitive enough equipment. But now, to get an age, you have to assume a whole bunch of things that you didn't have to before. Remember, you're just coming across this hourglass. You were not there at the start. So you have to assume the starting conditions. You're assuming that you began with all radioactive material and that there was no contamination at the beginning. You're assuming that the decay rate has been constant the whole time. There's no way you could know that for sure. You're assuming that no radioactive material has been added to or subtracted from the system since the beginning. You're assuming that no non-radioactive material has been added to or subtracted from the system. So you're making all these assumptions that can never be verified, and that's the real issue with this methodology when it's applied to such enormous timescales. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. These dating methods are not useless. Carbon dating has been demonstrated to be accurate to about 4,000 years ago. And what I mean by that is that it's been proven to give reliable results to things that we know the ages of because they've been historically documented. You can't just say that it's accurate back to 50,000 years ago when there aren't any written records from that period of time to cross-check your dates with. Carbon is interesting, though. In the same way that organic material breaks down very quickly over time, carbon decays very quickly. So much so that if we date dinosaur fossils that are millions of years old, we would not expect to find any radioactive carbon still there. It should have long since decayed to the point where our machines just can't detect it anymore. Well, guess what we find in these supposed 65 million year old dinosaur fossils? Guess what we find in coal seams that are supposedly hundreds of millions of years old? Guess what we find in diamonds that are supposedly billions of years old? We're finding significant amounts of radioactive carbon. But it can't be there if those millions and billions of years of time are true. And folks, in the end, what this really points to is that we all need a healthy dose of humility here. We have to recognize that, yes, radiometric dating methods can be useful when appropriately cross-checked with historical data. But we have to realize that we're working under a lot of assumptions when we choose to go beyond that timeline. Well, this is the last official video. Can you believe it? I do have something fun planned for bonus material, but it won't be like this. So I suppose I could close now with something along the lines of, and it takes more faith to believe in evolution than the Bible. And that would be true. But it's also being quite kind. Because in order to believe in naturalism, in order to believe that all this got here with no designer, no creator, no God, you have to have an irrational faith. You know, Christians are always accused of having blind faith, right? We don't, but blind faith is believing in something even though there's no evidence for it. Well, irrational faith is worse. That's believing in something even though all the evidence points in the exact opposite direction. And when we look at the observational science, whether we're looking at the evidence of youth in our solar system or distant galaxies, in diamonds or dinosaur fossils, or whether we're looking at the fact that life only comes from life, that the human genome is getting worse, not better, that natural selection goes the wrong way, it all points exactly away from a naturalistic worldview and exactly toward a world that was created much more recently by a God who cares for us and loves us. A God who loves you so much, a God who wants you by his side for eternity so badly that he sent his own son to earth on a rescue mission to save you. See, God is perfect, and to join him in heaven, we got to be perfect too. But we're not, obviously, not since the fall. God can't just let us into heaven because then he wouldn't be perfectly just. That's why we needed saving. Jesus didn't come into the world to make us perfect, though. He came to bear the consequence of our imperfection. He was the only one who could do this. Jesus had to be truly human so that he could bear humanity's punishment, and he had to be truly God so that he could actually shoulder that unbelievable burden. That's exactly what he did. He took all the ugliness off of you. He took all the bad stuff you've ever done, all the good that you refused to do, and he brought it with him to the cross, and when Jesus died, he left it nailed there. You are reconciled to God by the work of Jesus Christ. His resurrection from the dead is the proof that his sacrifice was sufficient to fulfill God's perfect justice. You know, unlike every other religion, there aren't a bunch of hoops and requirements that you have to jump through here on earth in order to win God's favor and get yourself closer to heaven. Jesus did it all. Every last bit of it. Everything we do here on earth is tainted with sin anyway, so it's not about what we do. It can't be. It's simply about trusting in what Jesus did. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And that's just what happened. You are forgiven. You are loved. You are reconciled to God. And I know that it's tough to feel that way sometimes. We are still living in this fallen world, after all. But remember, you're just visiting. Because when you close your eyes for the last time in this world, and you open them for the first time in the next, you're going to see your Savior face to face, and he's going to come running up to you. He's going to give you a great big hug. And he's going to say, welcome home.